Okay, good evening everyone, and thank you for joining us for the first of our two webinars marking the 10-year anniversary of the Enbridge spill into Talmadge Creek. Tonight we'll be exploring the national consequences of the spill. It's 5:58 in Michigan right now, and it was 5:58 nearly 10 years ago on July 25th, 2010 when the rupture occurred. Tomorrow's session, exploring local consequences of the spill, will begin at 11:17 a.m. over 17 hours from now. We have scheduled the sessions this way to give us all a real sense for how long oil was dumping into the watershed and how long it took Enbridge to finally shut it down. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that a spill occurred on the ceded lands of the Ottawa, Chippewa, and Potawatomi peoples. These three Algonquin nations first inhabited and cared for the land we will be discussing today. I am new to the world of pipeline safety, joining the Pipeline Safety Trust just a few months ago. As many of you know, the Pipeline Safety Trust was formed in response to the Olympic pipeline spill in Bellingham in 1999. And that tragedy serves as the moral bedrock of our organization. But if there's any other single incident that has significantly shaped our organization, in my opinion, it's the Enbridge spill 10 years ago, because it created a generation of activists, several of whom currently serve on our board. 2010 was a horrific and tragic year for pipeline safety, with an oil leak in Salt Lake City, the Enbridge spill we are remembering today, and of course the gas pipeline failure in San Bruno, California, killing 8 people and hospitalizing dozens more. Shortly after, Ntsb issued pointedly strong recommendations and Congress issued a detailed mandate, both trying to ensure we can avoid similar tragedies in the future. So here we are, 10 years later, to discuss what has changed since 2010 and what, if anything, has made us safer and what still needs to be done to get us to our mutual goal of zero incidents. Our last half hour today will be an audience Q&A. In order to submit questions to the panel, please email your question to questions@pstrust.org. Again, that's questions@pstrust.org. Today's webinar is being recorded and we'll have it available for viewing within a couple of days. For those of you attending tomorrow, which is almost all of you, I'm happy to say, I want to mention that while our official start time is 11:17 a.m. Eastern Time, we will start an EPA video about the spill at 11 o'clock a.m. and we encourage you to sign on early to view that video. If you log on between 11 and 11:17, don't be surprised by the video. You're not late to the webinar. I want to offer a warm welcome to our panelists. Thank you everyone for participating today. We're going to give each panelist an opportunity to offer some opening comments before we start our discussion. Let's start with Mr. Mark Schauer. Mr. Schauer was the U.S. representative for Michigan's 7th Congressional District, which includes the area of the rupture and the leak we are remembering today. Mr. Schauer, as I understand it, was the main driver of the congressional hearing, which uncovered some key safety information in the wake of the tragedy. Thanks so much for being with us today, Mr. Schauer.
Thank you very much, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here in the leadership role that the Pipeline Safety Trust is taking to remember what happened 10 years ago. I remember vividly where I was. It was actually the day after, so hours after the spill actually occurred, and I was sitting in my office in the Longworth House office building in Washington. I had just arrived for Monday evening votes, and my chief of staff called and said something horrific has happened. He described what we later found out was the largest inland pipeline spill in the Midwest ever, and from that moment on, it was all hands on deck for my office, and it was for months and months afterwards. Coincidentally, the next day, I had a meeting in the Roosevelt Room, a lunch with President Obama and a number of colleagues, and I was seated next to the president, fortunately, and I told him what had happened, and he said, I will dedicate whatever needs to happen to help address that spill. The next morning, I flew back to the district and I was there, and just to, I think the picture is important for people to understand the scale. Hopefully you've gone back and looked at video, looked at photos, but was driving along I-94, getting to Battle Creek, rolled down the window. This was in the evening. It smelled like a diesel fueling station. And then the following morning, I was on site, immediately went to the command center and then to the river, and it looked like chocolate was flowing down the river. It was literally unimaginable. So, and we've seen pictures of wildlife coated with oil. And again, this was heavy Canadian tar sands with toxic chemicals mixed in to help it flow through that old pipeline. So that picture is important. I will never forget it. And I'm proud of all of our efforts to work with PHMSA, Ntsb, the EPA, professionals who worked very hard to make this right. What I will say in the brief couple of minutes I have about this is really a story of failure. And it's a failure by Enbridge, who owned and operated that pipeline. And if I can be objective and honest, a failure by federal regulators, PHMSA included in that, failure by the Congress. Ironically, we held a hearing just weeks before. Jennifer, you remember when Enbridge assured us that everything was safe and the public didn't have anything to worry about. But most important, first and foremost, a failure by a company who put profits above the public trust. So I think this is a chance for us all to learn. And there was a great deal learned, and we all respectively applied those learnings as we went and after the process. But for industry folks that are on this webinar, and I appreciate you being here, because I think, my message is to understand your responsibility. Certainly you have a responsibility to your shareholders, but that's not the most important responsibility. The most important responsibility is the public, the public trust that you hold. Bill talked about who originally owned these lands. We are mere stewards. So it can never be profits at any expense. And I think that a lesson that Enbridge learned is that this was a very important, a very expensive case of negligence. Having been aware of corrosion in the pipeline in multiple areas, and being allowed to continue to pump Canadian tar sands oil through that pipeline, it was a very expensive lesson in terms of the billions that were spent, the fines, the penalties, and so forth. And I think the moral imperative is the most important one. It's to do things right, to protect the public trust, be good stewards of the public. So as I close, this company is still very much in the news in the Great Lakes state as Line 5 is under intense scrutiny. And candidly, I'm very fearful. I've seen what happened in a small creek, a tributary to the Kalamazoo River, and there was great fear at that time that that oil might actually reach the Great Lakes. I remember that. There was bipartisan concern in the Congress about that. And we must never let that happen. And so as we look at what policymakers and regulators do in relation to Line 5 through the Straits of Mackinac, we must keep that in mind and remember what happened 10 years ago. Thank you.
Alan Mayberry, the Associate Administrator for Pipeline Safety with PHMSA. Thanks for being here, Alan, especially after 2 full grueling days of committee meetings. Oh, I think you're muted, Alan.
Classic mistake. I'm the first one to do that today. But anyway, Bill, it's a pleasure to meet you in person. I know we've spoken over the phone, so I look forward to one day meeting you in person very soon.
Same here.
But it's Bill, yeah. So, and congratulations on your role at the Pipeline Safety Trust. And I appreciate the invitation to be here today. I was looking forward to your conference in New Orleans that you normally have, but unfortunately this year, under the circumstances, we couldn't do that. And of course, this year, you know, in memory of the event and the incident in Marshall, Michigan, it's very fitting to have this event today at the very time that the incident started. My role at the Office of Pipeline Safety is Associate Administrator. So I'm the head career official over pipeline safety, which means that as administrations change, I'll be around from administration to administration, but I'm a senior career official. Our agency's role is pipeline safety. We're not involved in siting of pipelines, such as the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission or the state authorities that are involved in the siting of liquid pipelines. FERC, on the other hand, is involved in natural gas pipelines. But we oversee about 2.8 million miles of pipeline in the U.S. of about a little over 200,000 miles is what we call hazardous liquid pipelines, which move crude oil, refined products, and the like that were involved in the spill in Marshall, Michigan. We are really divided up into three main functions. We develop and implement a policy for pipeline safety across the U.S. It's a national uniform standard for either gas pipelines or liquid pipelines, what we call the 192 standard or the 195 standard. And then we inspect and enforce against that standard. And then thirdly, we collect data on performance of pipeline systems, and we take action according to that data. And that helps inform where we go on our inspections. It helps inform us in policy making as well. We also have a training center in Oklahoma City that's the main facility for training of federal and state regulators across the U.S. So the oversight that we do, we have a very robust training facility, a state-of-the-art training facility in Oklahoma City that we're quite proud of. You know, there are major events that happen in your life that are memorable. And in my 39 years in the pipeline industry, with 14 years as a regulator here at the Office of Pipeline Safety, there's certain events that you remember that have a mark on your career. And I must say that the Enbridge spill in Marshall was one of those. You know, just like other, you know, for instance, I'm dating myself, but I can remember the day Kennedy was shot, and that's really dating myself. But this is one of those events, tragic events, that, you know, had a mark on my career. And, you know, every day, myself, along with the 307 other professionals here at the Office of Pipeline Safety, work to prevent this type of event. But I do remember that day, I was in a meeting with an operator, really going over performance metrics with a pipeline operator 50 feet from this office, where I am today at DOT headquarters. And I was pulled out of the meeting to be notified of, hey, there's a spill in this town called Marshall, Michigan. And then later, I remember it was the next day I was in a meeting with Congressman Schauer and others on the Hill to discuss, you know, what we knew of the event. I was providing an update. And of course, there was a lot of concern. We were concerned, the public was concerned, a lot of questions, answers needed. So I was quite busy at that time. And then ultimately, I would take 2 visits to the site. One, you know, just initially to get the lay of the land and to witness the event. But then secondly, there was a public meeting that I attended as well, and accompanying the Deputy Secretary of Transportation out there. We ultimately, there's some actions we took related to this event. We issued a corrective action order against the company. We took enforcement action. And then later, there would be issued by the department a call to action to improve pipeline safety across the U.S. And that was another initiative of the department that where we really focused on needing to improve and taking action to improve pipeline safety. And out of this, a number of initiatives happened, not the least of which included the Congressional reauthorization, where a number of mandates were given to our office to improve regulations. I'm happy to say that of those mandates that were issued in 2011, we've almost completed all of them. We're finishing up the last couple of mandates. One related to valve and rupture detection, a rulemaking that we're working on now that would improve pipeline safety and improve or prevent negative impacts like with the incident that happened in Marshall. There are a number of other changes we've made to regulations that we've already implemented related to control room management. And those we found that very critical in the aftermath of an incident, actions that occur in the control room need to be done with due diligence and in a timely manner. And that was one of the issues that came out of the Marshall, Michigan spill. With that, I think I will turn it back to you. I look forward to the question and answers session. And to me, that's part of the beauty of this and working with you is just getting into some of the back and forth dialogue. So I'll turn it back to you, Bill. But thank you again for inviting me today.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks for being here. Next, let's hear from Jennifer Homendy, a member of the National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB report and recommendations after the spill have been such an incredible resource, and we're thrilled that you're here, Member Homendy.
Thank you, Bill. It's interesting to be here because of my background's a little bit different. I was sworn in at the NTSB on August 20th, 2018. And while I've only been at the NTSB for 2 years, I feel like I've known the NTSB for almost 2 decades and worked with them very closely on a number of transportation safety issues. Because prior to joining the board, I was the Democratic Staff Director for the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials for the U.S. House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee for over 14 years, where the first thing I did when I went to the committee was work hard to elevate the importance of pipeline and hazardous materials safety within the Department of Transportation, which frankly was buried in an agency called the Research and Special Programs Administration. And so we created PHMSA in 2004 in the Norman Y. Mineta Research and Special Programs Act, and drafted with my colleagues the 2006 Act, the 2011 Act, of course, in response to Marshall and San Bruno. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I was on the phone with Carl and Alan and talking to Congressman Schauer. And of course, Jeff Weiss at the time, who was at PHMSA, and worked on the 2016 Act. We had a number of hearings and some oversight investigations as well. You know, for me, just like the congressman said, I will never forget where I was on July 25th and July 26th when I got a call from the chairman of the Transportation Committee. I can't remember if it could have been the evening of the 25th or the evening of the 26th, but I was at home and the chairman called and said, you know, there's been a spill. I need you to talk to Congressman Schauer, who was on the Transportation Committee at the time. And he said, can you go to Marshall, Michigan and lead the committee's oversight investigation of the spill? And so, of course, I remember taking the call from Congressman Schauer that night. And I was on the plane very shortly after that with one of our lead investigators on the committee. And, you know, just arriving in Marshall, I feel like I don't have the right words to describe it because utter devastation doesn't really do it justice. I mean, I remember the smell. You know, I remember oil blanketed, Talmadge Creek, Kalamazoo River, the river banks, floodplains. I mean, the environment was devastated. I went to the facility where they were trying to rescue the birds and the wildlife that were impacted. River restoration has now gone on for a decade. And while thankfully no lives were lost, people lost homes and people lost businesses. And about 320 people reported suffering symptoms consistent with crude oil exposure. And so for me, the most memorable moments for me is not what happened after the spill with the hearings and the legislation or even the NTSB report. For me, it's the time I spent with the people of Marshall and Battle Creek. I got to know someone named Susan Connolly, a local resident who was worried about air quality and for her children who went to school were at a local daycare. Susan and I became good friends. I mean, she watched my confirmation hearing in 2018, and went on to volunteer, I think, for Pipeline Safety Trust in some sort of capacity. I remember Deb and Ken Miller, who owned a carpet business in Ceresco Dam and lost their business. I remember I spent a lot of time with the residents of Baker Estates, a community of about 70 mobile homes right along the river. I walked the oil-saturated riverbanks with them and was invited into their homes and businesses to hear about the impacts of the spill. And see, what a lot of people don't realize, I'm sure that certainly the people from the communities who are listening, no one was evacuated from the mobile home park. In fact, no one was evacuated anywhere along the river. The county public health officials had issued a voluntary notice for homeowners who had never seen an oil spill or knew the impact of an oil spill to self-evacuate. And that's something the NTSB did address in the accident report. And looking back a decade later, now as an NTSB member, they are who I think about. Because well after the investigators have left, well after we're working on regulations and we're looking at how to address what happened at the spill, they're still dealing with the impact a decade later. So I will never forget Marshall and any other incident where entire families have been impacted by tragedies. And frankly, Marshall is the reason I'm here at the NTSB, because I don't want another accident like that to ever happen again. And so I'm at the NTSB to hope another family doesn't ever have to go through that. So Bill, thank you for inviting me. Beth, thank you for reaching out to me. I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. Next, we have Mike Koby, Vice President of U.S. Operations at Enbridge. This wouldn't be a fully meaningful conversation without Enbridge here. So thank you so much for your participation, Mike.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this roundtable. I think the way that we can truly learn from these incidents is through open dialogue between all stakeholders. And in this case, with Enbridge as the responsible party, I do think we can provide some important perspective, certainly along with the others here on the panel tonight. So thank you for having me. And thank you to Congressman Schauer for acknowledging that it is important to see and encouraging to see that members from industry are participating in events like this. I'll just start by mentioning that I've been speaking about Marshall a lot lately. And while I do in a normal year speak about Marshall on a regular basis, with the anniversary upon us, I've been participating in many different forums throughout Enbridge, and I actually even recorded my first ever podcast on the incident a few weeks ago, just in an effort to ensure we memorialize this event within our own organization for those of us who will come in the future. And this is all really because Enbridge's focus on using Marshall, the incident, to continue our improvement journey. And it's also because I was there, like many of you here today, on the response team in those early days. I was there for many months. Actually, I was there for the balance of 2010. So I too experienced and witnessed the impact firsthand. I've been involved ever since in ensuring that we've learned and we've improved as an organization because of Marshall. And I mention this simply to make the point that the Marshall event isn't something that's theoretical for me, or an event that I've studied from afar. It's personal to me. I was there, I saw its impacts, and 10 years later, it still does guide my decisions day in and day out. Maybe similar to Alan, I sort of view my career at Enbridge, which is about 20 years now, as a pre and post Marshall. Everything changed for me personally that day as well. So I do find putting Marshall and everything that has come after it into context in 5 minutes as something that's very difficult to do. But we've got 60 minutes of Q&A. So I'll do my best to cover it from a high level, at least from my perspective. And if there are other items, we can hopefully capture those off in the question and answer. So I'll just start by acknowledging that this incident really did shake Enbridge to the core. We understood very quickly the gravity and the impact of this incident. And it made us, in the moment, certainly, question everything about ourselves, rightfully so. We did, however, pivot very quickly, as stated by our CEO at the time, to a commitment that we would make it right. The core of this commitment was to return the river and the impacted lands back to their pre-release condition, if not to a better condition, and to address the associated unique issues related to the incident, like the local home values as an example. There was certainly a lot of those unique types of issues that we had never seen on an incident before. Looking back on it now, 10 years later, do a lot of coordination and cooperation between the EPA, the Michigan Environment, Great Lakes and Energy, or EGLE Department, and Michigan DNR. We believe we fulfilled that commitment, and the river today is cleaner and with more accessibility than it once had. And while certainly fulfilling our commitment to the communities that we've been a part of for many decades was our primary focus, it wasn't our only focus. Just as important and maybe more relevant for our first session today, I know the session tomorrow is a little more focused on the local impacts, is the fact that we had to learn as an organization from this event and put measures into place, not just here, but across our liquids pipeline systems to ensure that this could never happen again. We've been deeply focused on that. And as an example, since 2011, we have invested more than $8 billion on maintenance, inspection, and leak detection technologies across our liquids pipeline system. I think it's safe to say this is the largest, most comprehensive and sophisticated maintenance and inspection program any pipeline system in the world has seen to date. We've done this by significantly increasing the number of inline inspections using high-tech tools like our mini that are like mini MRI machines. You'll actually hear us refer to these often as ILIs or smart pigs. We have added control center staff while enhancing our control center procedures related to decision-making, our startup and shutdown procedures, our leak detection and alarms technology, and our communication protocols. And we've significantly increased our readiness to respond to an incident, conducting hundreds of drills annually, which has resulted in thousands of drills since the Marshall incident. And we do this so that we know our personnel have the right experience and that we have the right tools and equipment should we need it. All of these improvements, while from a very tragic event, are a direct result of the learnings from Marshall and the improvement journey that it set us on as an organization. So I'll just close maybe by commenting on culture. Another learning that we took from Marshall is a strong safety-focused culture is really essential to our success going forward. Systems, technology improvements, they're important, but they can only be as successful with a strong culture. This is one of the reasons we've embedded the Marshall incident into our company's DNA. We haven't tried to walk on from it or move away from it. We've tried to embrace it. Every employee to this day who joins our organization receives a ring that's made of steel from the pipeline that was involved in this incident, along with the Marshall story that their leader shares with them. We've also captured the Marshall incident as a foundational safety story. And one of the tools we use in this program is an emotional video of employees who are involved in the actual response, describing what it was like for them and the communities. And this is something that as an organization, we view on an annual basis near the time of the anniversary. And really the point of this video is to make sure that our employees not only understand the Marshall incident from a technical standpoint, but to really create an emotional connection to it so that we as a company never repeat it. Thank you, Bill.
Thanks, Mike. And finally, let's hear from our executive director here at the Pipeline Safety Trust, a true leader of pipeline safety, Carl Weimer. I'm so lucky to be working with you, Carl. Thanks for being patient with my incessant pestering questions over the past few months.
Thanks, Bill. Let me give a little broader context to today's discussions. The past decade was punctuated with many astounding pipeline failures that captured the attention of the nation. In June 2010, the people of Salt Lake City found crude oil running down the Red Butte Creek through backyards in the heart of the city. A month later, an Enbridge pipeline would fail near Marshall, Michigan, dumping nearly 1 million gallons of heavy tar sands crude into Talmadge Creek in the Kalamazoo River. 3 months later, a PG&E natural gas pipeline failed in San Bruno, California, killing 8 people and destroying a large part of the neighborhood. In 2010, these were the most egregious pipeline failures in recent memory, but the decade was only getting started, and these failures would soon be followed by descriptions of crude oil flowing between homes and down driveways from a failed Exxon pipeline in Arkansas, 2 different pipelines failing and dumping crude oil into the Yellowstone River, and high-profile natural gas pipeline failures in Pennsylvania, New York City, Maryland, and rural Kentucky. To put an exclamation mark toward the end of the decade, a failure by Columbia Gas of Massachusetts caused between 40 and 80 separate explosions and fires in homes throughout the Merrimack Valley in Massachusetts, killing 1 person, injuring 25 others, and forcing over 30,000 people from their homes, some for weeks, and causing over $1 billion of property damage. From a pipeline safety viewpoint, this was a decade we would like to be able to forget. In response to these horrific tragedies and the other 6,300 reportable pipeline failures that occurred during the last decade, both the pipeline industry and the regulators set out to improve safety through a series of new voluntary and regulatory initiatives. Looking just at the pipeline failure data, in too many cases, the numbers of failures appear to be rising, not decreasing. Although some companies, such as Enbridge that we're here to talk about today, seem to have learned the lesson from these failures. And in Enbridge's case, the amount of oil they are spilling each year has dramatically declined over the past few years. Others today have talked about these pending improvements, so I would like to speak to a couple of things that have not changed but need to. Let me tell you a brief story about Peter Hayes, a gentleman I met when the mayor of Salt Lake City asked me to come there after their spill. Peter was part of an advisory committee that had been formed to track progress and needed change after the Chevron spill there. He was a school science teacher, so he knew his stuff. He also lived right on Red Butte Creek and was adamant about the need to clean up and restore that creek. He spent hours of his time working to that end. Peter was also one of those folks that had a hard time letting go of things that he knew were wrong. He did not suffer fools or pipeline PR folks gladly. One of his most strident concerns was with regard to the health of all the residents who had been exposed to the myriad of chemicals that flowed down the creek in that oil. People in Salt Lake reported many health effects, including shortness of breath, coughs, fainting, and some children had seizures. These are the same health effects that were reported after the Enbridge spill in Marshall. after the Exxon spills in Arkansas and into the Yellowstone River, and in so many other places. While emergency responders struggled with controlling the spills, residents were breathing toxic chemicals. And in almost every case, no one seemed to know who was in charge of evacuating people to safe locations or what levels of toxic fumes were safe to breathe. Also, in almost every spill, people asked for long-term health monitoring and studies, so some of these questions could be answered. That has never happened anywhere, and that is one of the things that has not changed and needs to. Peter Hayes became an outspoken advocate for such health studies and monitoring until just 5 years after the spill in Salt Lake, when his own lungs failed him and he died of idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, a disease that is thought to be caused in part from exposure to the same volatile organic compounds contained in crude oil that flowed down Red Butte Creek past his home, and also flowed down Talmadge Creek into the Kalamazoo River and to many other places. So while many good things are in the works, the main thing that there has been little progress on how to deal with is how to deal with the public. The lack of concern about health effects for those impacted is perhaps the most egregious issue, but there are others. While we often hear from the industry and regulators that pipeline safety is a shared responsibility, there has been precious little sharing and collaboration when it comes to decisions about whether new pipelines are needed and where they are to be placed. There's little sharing or collaboration on how public can get specific information they need to consider pipeline safety. President Reagan coined the famous saying that we should all trust but verify, but unfortunately there is little opportunity for the public to be able to verify the new safety initiatives and regulations are actually providing greater safety or are just handy public relations efforts to assuage a concerned public. If you really want the public to trust pipeline safety, then the public needs to be involved in the review of these programs, and clear progress metrics need to be developed. In many industries, third-party audits of such programs are used to build trust and improvements, but that is rare in pipelines. And in the few recent examples for pipelines where such good third-party reviews were started, the industry seems to be pulling back from those efforts. I would ask that you please do not let the time from tragedies undermine your commitment to ensuring continuous safety improvements in clear, measurable ways to prove safety is improving. Let us all remember the Kalamazoo spill and all the other failures to help us move forward towards greater safety. Thanks, and I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Carl. We'll move into the moderated discussion now. And before we start, I want to remind the audience, because there are so many, we are asking that you submit questions for the audience Q&A section for the last half hour to questions@pstrust.org. We're not using the chat feature on Zoom or raising hands or things like that. So use that email. Our program director, Rebecca, is behind the scenes. Will be feeding us those audience questions. So, but in the meantime, let's start with, so Mr. Weimer has said that Enbridge's record over the past 10 years showed a decreasing trend in the amount of oil that is being spilled. How do we know whether that improvement is because, as Enbridge claims, that they've learned a lesson and developed deeper safety culture, or whether it's because PHMSA and the EPA has required them to implement changes through significant corrective action orders and consent decree? Maybe Mike first.
Thanks, Bill. I think it's all of the above. I don't think we can point to one specific thing. The requirements from the EPA, which I think were largely focused on the actual cleanup, or the consent decree that was entered into in 2017, so quite a few years after the incident, or Ntsb's report, which captured a lot of great learnings that were implemented by Enbridge and PHMSA, and the changes to regulation at PHMSA, plus the learnings at Enbridge. I think you have to look at all of these things as a cue to our improved performance. That's my view on the matter. I don't think any one party can take all the credit.
Alan or Jennifer, anybody want to go next?
Sure, Bill. First off, we're pleased with the improvements in Enbridge's safety record. And, I believe our mutual goal, and definitely the goal of PHMSA, is 0 incidents. We really need to get to 0. We do want companies to take a safety first approach in their decision making because it's the right thing to do and not just because it's a regulation. Now, one of the good things that came out of the incident would be, and I don't want to steal Jennifer's thunder, but I will actually recognize her and who she represents, was the recommendation to API to develop a safety management system standard. And I think that standard, which we ultimately had requested Enbridge to adopt, I think is key to safety improvements as we go forward. Maybe I'll turn it back to you, Bill.
Member Homendy?
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Just coming off of what Alan said on SMS, I mean, the NTSB's report, we issued 19 new safety recommendations as a result of the Marshall spill, and we reiterated 1 recommendation for a total of 20. All but one of those are implemented. And the one to API, which recommended that API develop a standard for implementing a safety management system program standard. That one we actually designated as not just closed acceptable, but exceeds recommended action. And that's because they went beyond just SMS and dealt with safety culture and other safety related issues. So we are actively working to encourage industry to implement SMS, not just in the pipeline industry, but really all across different modes of transportation in order to prevent an accident like this from happening again. I think, in general, and we can probably get into this later, just from my background pre-NTSB, it can be very frustrating when you start seeing the same issues in different pipeline accidents over the years. And, the NTSB is repeatedly saying these are safety issues that need to be addressed. And either they do eventually get addressed voluntarily, or more often than not requires congressional action, which can be, can be disappointing because we want to see action sooner rather than later. So I'm sure we'll get to that issue at some point, but so I'll turn it back over to you, Bill.
Thank you. Yeah, and we will. Congressman Schauer?
Thanks. Yeah. I talked a little bit about Line 5, which is very much on the mind of Michiganders and those states that border the Great Lakes, which, by the way, contain 20% of the world's fresh water. The issue that I'd like to raise is there have been a number of issues relating to anchor strikes and loose support. So there are concerns that are very real at this time. But related to that, I think, Mike, I know you've publicly addressed this. There's a very simple request that Governor Weimer has made about signing an airtight pledge to pay for any damages that might result from a potential oil spill into the Great Lakes, a question about whether Enbridge's parent company versus its subsidiaries have signed that. So I think as a gesture of good faith, and again, in my opening remarks, talked about the public trust, I think that would be a demonstration of good corporate responsibility.
Thank you, Congressman Schauer. Carl, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, I did. I finally figured out how to use that. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think the public needs to realize that there's multiple layers. There's regulations, there are voluntary efforts. But as I was trying to make the point in my opening remark, it's very hard for the public to know which of those are real and which of those are just sometimes PR spin. So take the example of pipeline safety management systems, which Ntsb has been pushing, the industry is really pushing it. I'm excited about it just because of the level that the industry is pushing it, but there doesn't seem to be any built-in metrics. So how does the public know 5 years from now whether safety management systems is actually accomplishing anything?
Thank you. Yeah. Let's see. Next question would be, PHMSA's integrity management rules are one of the most important efforts to prevent such pipeline failures. These rules focus additional testing and repair requirements on pipelines that operate in high consequence areas. Can you discuss why, despite these rules, significant incidents are occurring more frequently in high consequence areas than outside of them? Does anybody want to tackle that first?
Bill, I'd be glad to take a swing first since it's citing the PHMSA data. I took a look at our data, and the incident rate has been up and down. I think most recently incidents in high consequence areas took a downward turn, but they've been up overall over the last several years. But I matched that up also with an increase in mileage, significant increase in mileage. When you drill down to the data, it looks like a preponderance of issues related to equipment type failure. Now, what's an equipment failure? It looks to be issues related to pump seals and the like. It's not to lessen the impact of the failure. Any failures, we take a look at and it's unacceptable, but we are continuing to look at that, monitor that, and we'll see what we need to do. But that's just to give you a flavor for what we've seen with the data. But to make the point that the mileage is definitely up as well.
And so you're saying the mileage is up a lot more within high consequence areas than outside of them?
Well, it's up in both areas. There's just, as the network of pipelines expands, we're seeing an increase, obviously, in mileage in what we call high consequence areas and also non-high consequence areas.
Sure. So I guess my question would be, with these higher standards of testing and repair requirements within the high consequence areas, why we're seeing an increasing trend within those areas versus without?
Well, I think that's why we're looking at the nature of the spill. If it's the prescription, say, for an issue with a pump seal would be different than, say, an issue with, say, a crack-like defect, which was involved in the Marshall spill. So it's a different prescription. The regulations and our focus has been related to risk management, addressing issues that an operator can control through running more inline inspection assessments. We will take a look at this or continue to look at what we need to do related to issues that occur with, say, pump systems or flanges and the like, which seem to comprise a good bit of the data. I might add, too, that much like safety management systems, integrity management represents a journey, if you will, a constant process of learning your system, knowing your system, understanding the threats of that system, running tools to find issues, to find defects, and to take action against those defects. So over time, we would expect to see an improvement. Having said that, in light of the incidents that I know Carl's pointed out a number of, and others that we've not discussed today, including, and also especially the incident, Enbridge incident in Marshall, there are other lessons learned we're applying to improve rulemaking. So as we continue to address issues that we see, and I expect that will help. The other is, but again, I must stress it's a continuous journey. the other, very importantly, is related to safety management systems, which is currently outside the realm of regulation. It's our expectation that the operator will do the right thing, and we will monitor how operators have embodied the principles of safety management systems. But we see that as a key aspect. We can continue to regulate and implement new regulations, but we still need a good dose of a framework of safety management systems underpinned by safety culture to really bring the accident rate down. And that requires good decision making and understanding of operators of their systems.
Thanks, Alan. While we're talking about high consequence areas, is it true that the Great Lakes were not considered a high consequence area at the time of the Marshall spill? And if so, has that been corrected?
At the time of the spill, it's been, the Great Lakes are now classified as a high consequence area, or what we call, it's unusually sensitive area because of a variety of reasons, namely they're a drinking water resource, among others, but it wasn't explicitly classified as such at the time of the incident, but it is now, and that change was made in the past couple of years.
Thanks. It seems like having the at-fault party in charge of the cleanup effort, which seems to be the case except when the NTSB is investigating an incident, and the reporting and in charge of the site at a time when the community's trust is tested or broken is not the best way to handle the aftermath of a spill. I'm wondering if you agree and if there's a better way. Congressman Schauer, do you want to start?
Yes, I was jumping to raise my hand. I remember being at the command center, within 2 days, as soon as I could, getting back from Washington, and Enbridge was responsible for the spill at that time, and there were great concerns about the response, as has been talked about in opening statements. Not just the track record of missed alarms or ignored alarms and a late response in actually getting out and protecting the river after the spill had been detected. And so I pushed very quickly to have EPA take over control of that response, which they did. And, that had a positive outcome on the process. And so that's my, firsthand experience. And I think, I think it should be a party other than the company that caused the spill being responsible for the cleanup and forcing the company to do whatever has to be done. And the EPA did an incredible job at that time in doing that. So I think we should learn from that experience here 10 years later.
Thank you. Member Homendy, did you want to address that?
Well, when it comes to response, the NTSB isn't part of the response portion. We do the safety investigation and we leave the response activities to the other agencies to make those decisions. But we certainly work with those agencies and the other entities as we're progressing through our own safety investigation. So, on the response side, that's really something that the other agencies deal with.
Okay. I have to say, one of the first things that struck me after I started at the trust a few months ago was, why has it taken 10 years to incorporate the congressional mandates and the NTSB recommendations into PHMSA regulations? And why do so many of those rules not go as far as NTSB has asked or as PHMSA thought necessary in the corrective action order?
Well, Bill, I can take that as the first swing at that. First off, as I mentioned in my intro, safety is our priority. Safety is number one. That is our mission. And we take all the recommendations from the NTSB, mandates from Congress, and recommendations from other oversight agencies very seriously. We strive to implement them. Rulemakings, as you may know, are very complex in nature, and they provide, as we witnessed, the last 2 days, we had our advisory committee meetings where we brought stakeholders together, but involves input from a variety of stakeholders, and people have the opportunity to provide input and participate in the process. It takes time to address that appropriately. For all rulemakings, and we need to address all comments. We review all comments. We really promote people to engage in the process, but we do have to comment on all, or respond to all the comments that come up. And lastly, as we address the policy update based on the input that we receive, we bring and then after we post the proposed rule in the Federal Register, which is the federal government's newspaper, if you will, for publishing notices, we bring the final rule, what we propose possibly as the final rule, before one of two advisory committees, either our gas committee, or in the case of pipelines involving crude oil pipelines, the liquid committee. And there's a deliberation that happens over the course of a day or so. And I might add that I appreciate Carl Weimer's leadership and membership on the Liquid Advisory Committee. And of course, Sarah Gossman, who's also on the Pipeline Safety Trust Board, who's on our Gas Pipeline Committee. But anyway, it's very complex process that involves, our work. It involves a review by the Office of the Secretary and a review by the Office of Management and Budget before we're ultimately able to publish a final rule.
Congressman Schauer was the first, and we'll have Member Homendy after him.
Yeah, I tried to resist being the first on this one, since part of the question was about slow congressional action. Look, I was there in Congress just one term, and it was an exciting term, to say the least, punctuated by responding to the Line 6B spill. But I mean, I'll just make two very quick points. One, I think Congress's coziness with the industry is responsible in large part for the creation of a culture of industry self-monitoring and self-regulation. And so, as we know today more than ever, it's tough to get Congress to move on anything. But I think we need to educate the Congress in this process, and sort of realize, they need to realize their responsibility and who they're accountable to. So I think that's point one. The second is, Alan, I'm not as familiar as I was 10 years ago about PHMSA's funding level, but the agency has been woefully underfunded in its ability to have adequate staff to do its basic job of pipeline monitoring and pipeline safety.
Member Homendy, in addition to the comments you're planning on making, I was hoping you could also add how you feel about the regulatory response to the NTSB recommendations.
Well, first, let me start with how the NTSB works with PHMSA and the entities. I mean, we after a board meeting and we issue a final report, there's ongoing dialogue between the NTSB and those recipients of our recommendations. And it's constant discussions, and we spend a great deal of time as board members and staff trying to push the recipients to implement NTSB recommendations. And so that's a good part of my job outside of board meetings. One that I take very seriously. Alan and I talk quite a bit, and I know he communicates with our pipeline personnel. I will say, and I know it's very frustrating for to see how long the regulatory process takes. I am frustrated, and I talk about it all the time when we have a board meeting on how something can go by for 10 years and not be implemented. And I've stated it at press conferences after accidents. I will say, in PHMSA's defense, PHMSA actually has the best working relationship with Ntsb than all the other agencies within the Department of Transportation. They have addressed more of our recommendations than the other agencies. While there are a number that are open and we continue to focus on those, they have reached out to us and to our staff on a number of occasions, particularly under Alan's leadership, which I think he really brought when he started in that position, which was after Marshall, is a real focus to try to close those recommendations. And they've reached out to try to talk about ways on how they think they could address it. On the rulemaking itself, it's frustrating. It's frustrating for me. The public doesn't understand it. How could something take 10 years? I do think there's a lot that that the agencies have to deal with. I mean, Alan has to develop a proposal. What he can't tell you is he develops a proposal, then he's got to give it to the secretary, then it goes back, then he's got to give it to the OMB, then it comes back, and there's a back and forth a number of times. Then there's the peer review committees on top of that, which is something that is only exists for PHMSA. I know that FRA has the RSAC, but PHMSA has a statutory mandate for those two peer review committees. So that makes it difficult. And on top of all of that is the 2-for-1 rule. And that makes it very difficult, where you, in order to implement one regulation, you have to get rid of two. If you're in the business of pipeline safety, what are the two you get rid of? So that's very difficult, and it's frustrating. And calling on just my past working for Congress, you know, implementation of Ntsb recommendations should happen by the recipients, should be implemented by the federal agencies. Congress should be the last stop. It shouldn't require Congress to force action. And in many instances when I was on the Hill, we were trying to address recommendations that had been issued for, you know, I'll take excess flow valves. The Ntsb issued recommendations on excess flow valves since 1970. And it was after the terrible tragedy in South Riding, Virginia in 1998, where it got some momentum to address that, but it wasn't until 2006 that Congress mandated it because nobody took action. So, you know, we don't go away. You know, my job is to continue advocate for those Ntsb recommendations, whether it's 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we continue to do the job working with the different entities, but it is very frustrating, the whole process.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great answer and really helps put it all in perspective relative to the other agencies. Thank you. Carl?
Yeah, just briefly, and if you want to move on, just wave at me, Bill, and I'll shut up. But, you know, I think PHMSA is an easy target. I get invited to a lot of congressional hearings, and you go to those hearings and what you hear is one congressman after another complaining about what's wrong with PHMSA, why are they so slow? And some of that is probably warranted, but they're an easy target. What the public needs to realize that it's not just PHMSA. Congress themselves puts things in the statute. PHMSA can only implement new rules where they have the authority to do so. And Congress has put some stuff in the statute that makes it very hard for PHMSA to implement new rules. They have to go through a cost-benefit thing. So the White House requires that too. Or even today in our committee meetings, we were talking about there's a part of the statute that once you build a pipeline and put it in the ground, PHMSA can't pass new rules that make you change that pipeline. So if you're looking at new automated valves to limit the amount of oil that's going to go into a river like the Kalamazoo River, if that pipeline's already there, PHMSA can't tell them to put new valves on that pipeline because of what Congress has put in there. So there's lots of blame to go around. Both the administrations, Democrat and Republican, have executive orders that stand in the way of faster rules. And certainly Congress has put things in the way of faster rules too. So plenty of blame to go around.
Thanks, Carl. We are going to move on to the audience Q&A. Rebecca has been feeding me some great questions. We have some smart people in our audience today. First, I'll start with a broad one. What specific changes have been made to ensure this won't happen again by Enbridge, the state, EPA, and PHMSA? Mike, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. I alluded to some of them in my opening comments. I think the biggest one is the expansion of our integrity program. We regularly run more ILI tools, or the SMART tools that I mentioned, which are highly technical tools that can take measurements of corrosion, cracks, other types of threats that pipelines experience. And we run them on a very frequent basis. Often we will run more tools in our system alone in the United States than the other pipeline companies combined. So there's been many advancements there, not only in the frequency of how often we run the tools, but in the actual technology. We've worked with the vendors, GE's one of the big one, to advance the detection thresholds of those tools as well, so that we can see issues even sooner than we could back in the Marshall days 10 years ago. There have been advancements to our control center operations, much more black and white, stricter rules on how we operate our system. As you know, if you've read the incident investigation, how we were operating in the control center contributed to the amount of oil that was out. I think it was Carl just mentioned automated valves. While we aren't regulated, as he mentioned, to put them in, we have had an automated valve program that we have been executing in the 10 years and have expanded them exponentially across our system. Our public awareness programs, our outreach, really every one of our, what we call our prevention programs have advanced many times over in that time frame. And I'll go back to some of that was self-discovery within Enbridge. Some of it was driven by the Ntsb investigation, by new regulations, by the EPA. So those are just a few examples.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Does anybody else want to tackle that, or should we move on to some more specific questions? Let's move on. So, spill response planning rules require that operators identify the worst case discharge for each planning response region. When the Line 6B rupture occurred, Enbridge's response plan claimed their worst case time to isolation was less than half an hour. But as we all know, it took 17 hours before the pump stations were stopped and the valves closed. So there's two parts to this. The first goes to Enbridge. Has your response planning for that region changed to acknowledge that your worst case discharge is at least as large as the spill from Line 6B? What is the time to isolation that you now use in your response plan?
Well, I think the person who asked the question mentioned we have different response plans for different areas, different regions, as they pointed out. A slight nuance to what happened at Marshall is the pipe didn't actually run for 17 hours from initial rupture to the time of discovery. It actually ruptured on shutdown. that was one of the reasons that it was not initially identified, because the pipe was shut down and it ruptured just right at that same time. And so we attempted to restart it twice in that 17-hour period for a short period of time, which resulted in a large volume out. So that's that part of that question. The second part is that, yes, we have gone through and updated our worst case discharge scenarios throughout our liquids pipeline system. Those have actually gone through quite a bit of scrutiny and review by the regulators such as PHMSA and others. And so, yes, they have all been updated since Marshall.
The second part would be to Alan. What changes has PHMSA made in its review and approval of spill response plans to ensure that operators are prepared for an actual worst case time to isolate ruptures?
Thanks for the question. We've actually made, in the aftermath of this incident, we made major changes to our program to review spill response plans. And it's a new process that we implemented that involves a primary review and a secondary review. But it undergoes 2 quality control checks just to make sure that the plan is complete, relevant, and accurate. And then we've dedicated additional resources. We have today, prior to Marshall, we had probably 2 people involved in spill response plans review. Today we have 4 to 5, on occasion 5, involved in that same review process. So just dedicate a lot more resources in a very robust process.
Thanks. And Congressman Schauer, I see your hand is raised. Before I get to you, the audience member is reminding me that I did not, that Mike, you did not answer what is the time to isolation that you now use in your response plan?
Again, because each response plan is unique, the time to isolation varies from response plan to response plan. And I honestly do not know off the top of my head what it is for the Marshall location, if that's what they're getting at.
Yeah, I think that's what they were asking. Okay.
Unfortunately, I do not know off the top of my head.
Okay. Congressman Schauer?
Yes. Perhaps panelists can tell me whether this issue has been addressed, but it's a related disclosure transparency issue. During our investigation after the spill, we found that material safety data sheets didn't reflect the chemicals and the oil that were being transported through the pipeline, which had a direct bearing on the local health department's response and the state's response in terms of evacuation. Jennifer talked about that in her opening remarks. So I think that's a similar issue, which I'm curious if it has been addressed. If it hasn't, it needs to be addressed. Invite.
I'm assuming you're asking me, or are you asking one of the other?
Alan, perhaps as regulator, or Mike, anybody that has knowledge, because that related, again, to the evacuation and directly to public safety.
I don't think PHMSA regulates material safety data sheets, so maybe I'll try that one. And so the issue you're referring to is when the spill first occurred. We have specific MSDSs, as they're called, for each type of oil that is transported in our system, of which there's over 150, I believe, at any given time within the system that are moved in batches. And so when the incident initially occurred, we also have representative MSDSs for the different types of crude oil, so heavy, medium, and light and we knew that was a heavy oil. We provided a heavy oil MSDS sheet and then followed it up later, once we had identified exactly which batch it was, it actually ended up being two different batches that were involved in that spill. So I'd say yes, it has been addressed. In that case, it was a matter of timing.
And Mike, I recall part of the problem was those were not, perhaps the updated ones weren't filed or being timely filed with local governmental officials. I remember from testimony and our committee hearing at that time that was reflected. That's why the local health officer didn't have the information that he needed to issue a proper evacuation order to protect the public safety.
It might be Congressman Schauer. I don't recall.
Next question. Given the mergers and dissolutions of pipeline companies over the years, how does the industry ensure that the highest quality control is maintained as companies evolve? For instance, if Enbridge were to be absorbed by a new parent company, how would the lessons of Marshall be sure to not be lost in the transition?
I'll maybe just start, if that's okay. I think the recommendation around 1173 or the management system that was not regulated, but the majority of the industry, I believe, has adopted it, including Enbridge. We've been very active in with API and the development and the implementation of that program, is to have a common level of expectation around safety across the industry. So that is one way. I'm not sure that would capture all the true culture of our learnings at Marshall, but certainly the technical learnings for sure.
Either Alan or Member Homendy, do you have anything to add from the government side, if there's anything in these transitions?
Probably.
Well, no, go ahead.
That's one for Alan.
Okay. Now, our regulations apply regardless of the operator, and as a divestiture occurs or a merger or acquisition, we inspect the operator. One of the issues we've had to do is to make sure that our tracking of the operator and the specific pipeline asset is accurate, so that we make sure that for an asset that is owned by Enbridge, for instance, that we are indeed inspecting Enbridge, and that if say they had divested or acquired an asset, that we have that accurate. So we have a careful process to make sure of that.
Great. Another audience question. Enbridge and the industry at large spend a lot of time talking about how transparent they are with the public, yet vital information like how operators identify high consequence areas, where those are, and how operators determine their worst case discharges are routinely kept from the public by operators like PHMSA, making it impossible for the public to be reassured that the operators and regulators are adequately protecting important sensitive areas. Other than things like drinking water intakes, why do operators not make public the location of their high consequence areas? And why does PHMSA keep its mapping of HCAs secret from the public?
Well, first off, we do have a public viewer in our national pipeline mapping system. For security reasons, there's a limitation on the accuracy that people can see. Aside from that, we have a very robust and transparent website where we post a lot of data related to pipeline operators. You can drill down from the overall pipeline system, from say hazardous liquid pipelines down through specific operators down to specific units. And that's all on our website. Related to other areas that we look at when we inspect, for instance, integrity management plans and the like, those are items we look at and review when we are visiting the operator, but those aren't items that we retain. What we do retain are required data collections. If there's a safety-related condition that an operator needs to report to us and their actions that they take
Let's see. An Enbridge gas pipeline ruptured in British Columbia in 2018. And from published reports, it seems like there are a lot of similar factors that led to the failure of the line 6B failure: wrapped tape coating, stress corrosion cracking, postponed ILI run, and a risk model that underestimated crack growth rates. Enbridge claims they have improved their integrity management system since 2010, but this rupture occurred 8 years after the line 6B failure. Enbridge owns and operates a large number of vintage pipelines. Their record casts doubt on the industry's claims that these lines can be operated safely and on the adequacy of existing regulations. Please discuss this situation.
Assuming that one's for me.
I think that one's for you.
Right. Yeah, so we have spent a lot of time here over the last hour talking about the transformation that Enbridge and the industry, in some cases, have gone through over the last 10 years. These are very complex systems that require a high degree of technology to operate them and ensure they are safe and fit for service. It sort of goes back to the question of, I guess, divestitures and acquisitions of a few questions ago here. We had acquired those assets in 2017 from another operator. And so we are in the process of implementing the learnings that we have from Marshall from an integrity standpoint, from an emergency response, et cetera, into those assets. So that's our gas transmission and midstream business unit. So that transformation is underway. The submitter of the question is correct. There were some similarities between the two incidents, although one being gas and one being oil. So that transformation is underway, and it is something that we are acutely aware of.
Thanks, Mike. Next question. Carl Weimer indicated that embracing third-party verification would go a long way to establishing public trust. What model would you believe is workable to balance the need for more pipeline infrastructure and allowing timely approval of projects and the very legitimate concerns and requirements of local stakeholders and safety environmental concerns? Is that balance possible in your opinion? Carl, I believe that one's for you.
All right. Yeah, there are models in other industries, particularly the chemical industry, who's embraced, third-party audits. So things like integrity management, safety management systems, they'll often bring in third parties to look at that, and then they'll report out to the public, sometimes taking the names of the actual company off, but sometimes they leave those on. There's been some efforts to do that throughout North America. The one I'm most familiar with was north of the border. The big transmission companies north of the border were moving forward on an Integrity First program to kind of have third-party audits of their integrity management programs. And I think that's still underway, but some of the big companies up there, I understand, are kind of backing away from that or even dropping out of that system, saying that, it's kind of an unneeded another layer. I think those go a long way to reassuring the public when a third party comes in, and especially when you're reporting out, because like so many people have said, spill response plans, integrity management, a lot of this ILI, smart pig runs is pretty hard for the public to understand, but some kind of independent view of how those things are going is really valuable. But it seems like some of the companies are pulling back, and the regulators hardly ever mandate those types of things.
Thanks. We just have We just have a few minutes left. The latest question here. ILIs, inline inspections, are not new. Their use is more widespread, but pipelines continue to fail. What do your ILIs have today that they didn't have in 2010? So this is the smart pigs and things like that that Mike was talking about earlier. Mike, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to get the unmute button. So they have advanced in their ability to, or their detection limits, what I would say has been the biggest advancement. But for Enbridge in particular, I won't speak for the industry, but for Enbridge, it's the frequency at which we run them. There are regulations that mandate how often you have to run them, both in gas and oil pipelines in the US anyways. And we run them on a much more frequent basis than that. We have a baseline of our entire liquids pipelines system and then multiple runs since that, where we can measure the changes from tool run to tool run so that we know with what frequency we have to run them going forward based on what's happening in the pipeline. And that's not the way the industry used to operate 10, 15 years ago.
Okay. One more for you, Mike. You're popular here today. If Enbridge has really changed its safety culture, as they say, why were they fined $2.7 million for violating the terms of the consent decree with Department of Justice? Isn't that a cultural problem?
Isn't it a what problem? Sorry, a culture problem?
Yeah. Problem.
Yeah, so we entered into a consent decree with the Department of Justice back in 2017. It is a very complex agreement that has quite a bit of ambiguity that both Department of Justice, the EPA, and Enbridge has had to work through since that time to understand what was intended by many of the things that were put in there. What I can say on these, on the fines that were referenced in this question, that if you go through and you look at each one of the items that we were cited for in that administrative order, they are almost across the board administrative items. They were not items where the pipeline was in any risk or that we had failed to do something that we had agreed to do. So in many cases, they were items where you have a multi-step process where you have to run your tools within a certain amount of time. Then you have to get your results back in a certain amount of time, get your dig package to go out and do your verification, et cetera, et cetera. The majority of them where we were late at one of those steps along that path, but the entire process was completed on time and the pipe was never at risk.
Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thank you once again to all of our panelists, both for your participation and for all your work towards our mutual goal of zero incidents. Thank you to our audience, both for your great questions. I was super impressed, and for your generous donations. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time for the EPA video and 11:17 a.m. Eastern Time for part 2 of our webinar, in which we'll explore the local consequences of the Enbridge spill. If your question wasn't addressed today, we have moved a bunch of the local focus questions to tomorrow. So they haven't been lost. They're in the queue for tomorrow, and hopefully we'll get to them. Have a great evening, and thanks again.
Thank you.
So.
Thank you.